Everyone knits a little bit differently, which means your stitches might be tighter or looser than mine, even if we're knitting the same project with the same yarn and the same tools. Hi, I'm Hannah from knitting.com, and today we'll talk about what gauge in knitting exactly is. Gauge refers to how many stitches and rows you have in a square inch of knitted fabric. By matching your gauge to what the pattern uses, you can ensure that your project will be the same size as the pattern's finished project. If you're ready to go, let's get started. So today we're going to look at what makes a good swatch briefly, and then we're going to show you how to measure the stitches in your gauge swatch. Starting here, I've made a gauge swatch that has a garter stitch border because I want it to lie perfectly flat for when I'm measuring. I want to make sure it's as accurate as possible. Also, this is knit back and forth, and this will give me the gauge for knitting back and forth in this stitch pattern. If you're knitting a project in the round, so on circular needles, you want to knit a gauge on those needles. Your gauge in the round will be different than when it's the same stitch knit flat. So in this case, we're going to measure this for a knit flat stockinette gauge swatch. The first thing to do is make sure that your swatch has the garter stitch border, it's lying flat, it's blocked if that's what your pattern calls for, so it means it's been soaked and dried so that all the stitches relax. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to take a tape measure or a knitting needle gauge. In this case, the tape measure felt more useful, so I can show you a couple different dimensions. A good swatch will include at least 4 inches of fabric in both directions to measure from. In this case, I have, let's say, 5.5 good measurable inches that are flat. So I always knit more than I need to measure in both directions. And then the next step is to find a row in the center, not towards the edges where they're getting distorted by the other stitch patterns, or if it's still in your needles, not too close to the knitting needles where that will distort your row count or your stitch count. So right in the center, and the stitches going side to side, that's the stitch count. And then the stitches vertically, that's your row count. So in this case, we're going to start with our stitch count, just going left to right. I'm going to lie my fabric, my measure, so that it starts at the edge of one stitch, so you can see the V's here. My 0 mark is at the side of one of those stitches. It's not on the very edge stitch, it's in a little bit. Then I'm going to make sure that it's lining up across a row evenly, all the way across, so we're not angled, it's just flat. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start counting the V's that I see all the way until we hit 4. So in this case, I have, and I'm going to use a knitting needle to be a little bit, get my finger out of the way. We've got 1 stitch here, so 1 V, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6, 7, 8, and a half. There's half a stitch here, it's not quite the full thing, so 8.5 stitches across 4 inches. So remember that. And now we're going to divide that by 4 to get our 1 inch stitch count. So 8.5 divided by 4 equals 2.125. So you can see why it's important to go all the way across 4 inches to get that average rather than just stick with 1 inch. You won't get quite the same measurement. So here it does look like that, but I would have just said 2 stitches, and the 0.125 adds up over time. The longer you knit, the bigger the difference that makes in terms of the size of your project. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to take your tape measure and you're going to measure the row gauge. Your pattern will ask for both of those, and you want to match both. So in this case, I'm going to line it up with a column of stitches all the way down. And again, I'm going to measure 4. I'm going to start in from the edge a little bit. My knitting needle to point out the V's again to make it a little bit easier to see. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 and a half. So 13 and a half row stitches divided by 4 again equals 3.375. So you wouldn't ever really get that measurement if you only did 1 inch. So it's good that we did that. So now that we have our row and stitch gauge, we can compare that to the pattern. In this case, that's what I wanted to get. However, if your stitch pattern does not match, if your gauge does not match what the pattern calls for, here are the ways that you can adjust that. If you have more stitches per inch than the pattern calls for, so say I had 5 stitches per inch rather than the 3 some odd that I had earlier, or 2 some odd, then what you're going to do is you're going to use bigger needles to make bigger stitches. So there's more stitches per inch, or fewer stitches per inch. If you have fewer stitches than what the pattern calls for, you're going to want to size your needles down so that your number of stitches matches what the pattern calls for. So there's 2 ways to do it. You can either use smaller or larger needles to change the density of your fabric, so how much or how few stitches are in each inch. You can also change the yarn you're using. So everything impacts the size that you're getting, and because every knitter is unique, every gauge swatch is unique as well, even from day to day. So it's always worth doing them, and it's always worth taking the time to do those measurements and follow all the instructions that the designer has asked you to do in the pattern. And that's a brief guide to measuring a gauge swatch. Congratulations! You're now a knitting gauge aficionado. Hopefully this tutorial convinces you to knit a gauge swatch before every single project, or at least take the extra time with those particularly tricky stitch patterns. It's worth it in the end, I promise. If you found this tutorial helpful, be sure to click the thumbs up and leave a comment down below. Subscribe to knitting.com if you'd like to stay in the loop, and check out our other social media channels. Thanks for watching. Until the next one, happy knitting.